Today is November 11th, 2018. We're in Chicago at the American Heart Association Annual Scientific Sessions. I'm Dr. Paul Wang, Editor-in-Chief of Circulation, Arrhythmia, and Electrophysiology. It is my distinct honor to interview today Dr. Bob Myerburg, a true pioneer in cardiac arrhythmias and sudden cardiac death. It's great to have you here, Bob, today.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So first, I'd like to have you tell us a little bit about what led you into medicine in the beginning.
I don't know. It seems like it was there from the beginning. I always wanted to go to medical school. There was this period of time when I was about 7 years old when I wanted to be the Royal Mounted Police in Canada, but I gave that up pretty quickly. And throughout high school and college, medical school was it, except for one short period of time where I decided I really wanted to be a dentist. Don't know where that came from, but it went away quickly.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing that, Bob. What about, I know you went to University of Maryland, studied medicine there, and then did residency at Charity Hospital in Louisiana. What made you decide then to do training in cardiology? What led you to cardiology after your internal medicine residency?
Well, cardiology was always fascinating to me. The heart as an organ, its physiology and anatomy. I remember in biology classes always being enthralled by the nature of the heart and the nature of the cardiovascular system. As I said, there were some other things that we went through in between, but I do remember one period of time where I thought about OBGYN. That was during my, in the junior year, my first rotation. It took me only the first night on call to come back to cardiology. And from then on, it was straight cardiology.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So I know you did cardiology fellowship at Grady Memorial in Atlanta. What was cardiology like in those days? Could you share a few stories with us?
So cardiology in my days of training and in my days of medical school was very different than it is now. There was a clinical side to it, which was very, very focused on clinical cardiology, bedside cardiology. And then there was the scientific side, which was more in the realm of physiology. And these two camps in cardiology didn't interact very much. One of the greatest contributions of the cath lab is that it brought anatomy and physiology together, and we began to think together. So there was this period of time where going to the cath lab was not just a diagnostic procedure, but it was working out physiology. This was before interventions. This was before PCI. This was before we were doing ablations for arrhythmias. And we spent an awful lot of time in the lab figuring things out and then testing them in the basic science laboratory. So those were the days of development of where cardiology is now. Where cardiology is now is we've dichotomized again. We have people who are very much lab-oriented, and we have people, probably not enough of them, that are bedside-oriented. And it's not quite as together as it was when we made that first transition from bedside cardiology to the science of cardiology and then to interventional cardiology.
Great. Well, one of the things that we know, you've been a mentor to hundreds of people, but who are your mentors? Who are the people that really influenced your career, the different times and milestones in your development? What would you tell us about those individuals?
Well, there were several of them. The first one I remember is probably somebody you don't know by the name of Henry Marriott, Barney Marriott to his friends. One of the great early electrocardiographers. And he was on the faculty at the University of Maryland when I was there, and he loved to teach rhythm analysis to students. And when he could find students who were interested, he would lock onto them and really go out of his way to teach. So that was Barney, Henry Marriott. Willis Hurst was my next important mentor. And Willis, in his heyday, was the ultimate clinician. He didn't care very much about science. He cared about bedside cardiology. He cared about examining the patient and what we had in our hands then, which is very different than now, for treating the patients. The next one that I had was Brian Hoffman. So when I was finishing my fellowship at Emory, the plan was for the people at Emory that they would send me to New York, to Columbia, for a couple of years with Brian Hoffman to learn some basic science, because there was very little basic science at Emory in those days. It's changed now, but it was limited then, and particularly in cardiology. So I spent the time with Brian Hoffman, and Brian Hoffman was another one of those great teachers, except he taught at the bench, not at the bedside. So I got a tremendous education in the basic science of electrophysiology under him. I have one problem with Brian that was always a problem, and that is if you go to him with a difficulty that you're having at the bench, something's not working out at the lab, he would come there, he would help you, and then he would take over the experiment. So, you know, go away, Brian. If you fixed it, let me finish it. You know, that was him. He himself loved being at the bench so much that you go to him with a problem, he fixed the problem, and then he takes over the experiment. One that was not a person who I could say was a direct mentor, but who gave me advice. He was not one of my true teachers, and that's Gene Brownwald. Gene Brownwald was, through my years, periodically would give me good advice, and that was very helpful. So those are the people I would most think of in terms of who my mentors were.
Great. Well, thank you for taking us through a history about all that. That's really very fascinating. Could you tell us a little about your relationship and work with Augustin Castellanos?
Well, that was the greatest. So the story on Tino, as his friends knew him, Tino was an immigrant from Cuba. His family came over in the 50s. He had just gotten his medical degree, and he had to repeat his training years in Miami in order to get a Florida license. But he ultimately got the license, and he was a junior faculty member in the mid-60s when I was there in the public health service as my military duty. Part of what I did was at the health department, and part of it was in a research lab. And Tino and I became friends at that time. And again, it was about reading EKGs and discussing things. And Tino was more than an electrocardiographer. He was a philosopher. And there's all sorts of things we talked about. So when I left to go into training, I wasn't anticipating coming back to Miami, but to come back to the Atlanta story. While I was in New York, I got a call from Miami, would you like to come down and take a look at a job here? Well, my plan had been to go back to Atlanta. So I went down there, interviewed with Tino, interviewed with the chairman of medicine, a number of people, and I ended up taking the job as chief of cardiology at the VA, which I did for 3 years, and then became chief of cardiology for the university, which I did for 31 years. Crazy. But there was one stipulation of my going to the VA. I would only accept the job if Tino would agree to come with me and join me on the faculty there, and he did. And that's what closed the deal. And that also sealed our relationship until he retired. I think he retired around 2011, and he passed away about a year ago. But he was a terrific person. Yeah. And he was another great teacher.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Great. Wonderful. Well, I remember reading in 1964, you wrote one of your earliest papers on sudden cardiac death and coronary artery disease. What led you to, write that paper, but then ultimately devote your career to that?
Okay, so answering the second part first, why did I get interested in sudden cardiac death? I think the reason is, and I'm not sure, but I vaguely remember as a young person, probably around before my teen years, maybe 10 or 11 years old, a story that my parents were telling about 3 generations in a family that were friends of theirs, in which the men died suddenly at age 39 and nobody could give them an explanation. And that stuck with me. You know, that's a young kid hearing a story like that. Why does that happen? And sort of that stuck. And then there was another neighbor who died suddenly at a relatively young age. And those are the things that coupled with what I learned from Barney Marriott about arrhythmias. So you put those 2 things together and it just takes you right into the sudden death field. So fast forward to the mid-60s when I'm in Miami doing my military duty, and I'm spending some time with the medical examiner, a guy named Joe Davis, who was an incredible medical examiner. He kept everything. And he had a whole pile of sudden death cases that he had studied back through many years. Not only did he have the records, he had the tissue. And we could go back and look at the tissue and get definitive questions answered about the extent of coronary disease. And there was this association of coronary artery disease with these sudden deaths. The purpose of that study was not so much finding the cause. It was to find out the risk to the community. Were innocent people being harmed by people having a cardiac arrest in the community? And the answer was really not. There were very few. We made a warning that certainly school bus drivers with coronary disease shouldn't be driving school buses, even if they appeared stable. But we didn't have any data that said it created a risk. These people managed to get to the side of the road probably because they were having chest pain. And that sort of stuck with future studies on that topic.
Yeah, great. Well, take us into the future perhaps, or your current thoughts about sudden cardiac death, particularly first the issue of classification. How good do you think we're doing in terms of classifying what we otherwise consider sudden cardiac death? Are we doing it well? What are the opportunities that we could have to make that diagnosis better?
We're doing it better. We're not doing it as well as I'd like to see. If you go back in the history of how classification began, it began with death certificate studies. Death certificates are terrible. They do not give you the right information. There's another issue about death certificates that came in to play when, this goes back, I guess, to the late 70s, when cardiac arrest and sudden death was considered A, due to myocardial infarction, B, a disease of white males. So studies were done in white males who had myocardial infarction who died suddenly. And if you didn't have that on the death certificate, myocardial infarction, then that didn't count as a sudden death even if the patient died suddenly. On the other side of the spectrum are patients who had cardiac arrest, but it was not due to a cardiac cause. And so that gets into an important classification issue, such as lung disease. Lung disease is a common cause of cardiac arrest. And identifying those is an important difference compared to true cardiac cause. A nice paper came out from San Francisco recently on that very topic.
Yeah, great. You've recently done, very recently, some work with investigators in Finland.
Yeah.
Could you tell us about that research? It's really fascinating.
Yeah, that's not so recent.
Oh, okay.
So beginning in the late 1980s, we've had a series of three or four investigators who have joined us from Finland for 2 years, sometimes a 2-year stint and then another 1-year stint. And we currently have somebody there right now who did research with us. Now, the nice part about this is Finland has mandatory autopsies for people who die suddenly. So they have really good anatomic data. Now I'm getting back to your question after giving you the background. The investigators that we were working with, this was somebody who was here in 2009 to 2011, and as sort of an aside, he says, oh, by the way, we've got a series of patients who died suddenly. The only anatomy they had was fibrosis in the myocardium. They had no coronary disease, they had no evidence of hypertensive LVH, just fibrosis. What do you think we ought to do with that? And I said, I think you ought to go home. I think you ought to do broad genetics panels on them and see what you come up with. So a couple years later, I get a call, and he says, I think we have something. And it turns out that about a third of those victims who had pure fibrosis had genes that are associated with either hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, dilated cardiomyopathy, or right ventricular dysplasia. None of them had channelopathy genes. So these appear to be a subset of patients who carry the genes for the structural inherited disorders, but only express the fibrosis part of it. Bottom line message, somebody dies suddenly, has only fibrosis, you need to do genetics to go back to the family to see if there's other carriers. Fascinating thing that came out of it. And if they weren't, that's what I love about working with the Finns, because they've got the resources and the setup to do this, genetics on these patients and do it properly. So that was a terrific experience. And now we're working on hypertensive hypertrophy with fibrosis.
Great. Well, that's really pioneering work, Bob.
Yeah.
Take us to your thoughts about the future. What do you think the key discoveries are going to be? How are we really going to defeat sudden cardiac death? Take us into the future in your mind. What do we need to do?
Okay, so you asked me two questions. One's answerable, the other isn't. What do we need to know? What we need to know is who's at risk as an individual. If you tell me that 5% of a given profiled population has a risk of sudden death over 10 years, and then I'm sitting in front of a patient who asks me, what is my risk? I don't have anything meaningful to tell them except you're at higher risk than the general population, but you're not high enough for a defibrillator. All we can do is preventive cardiology, which is, and I don't want to minimize that, that's important, certainly for the coronary disease part of it. But then the other part, which I can't answer, is the most important part, and that is how do we get to the point where we can talk to an individual and say to this individual, within this subgroup, you're in a subgroup, which gives you a 20% chance of cardiac arrest within the next 5 years. If you can say that, you've qualified them for a defibrillator, but we can't do that yet. Individual risk prediction is the biggest challenge in front of us. Not just for this, for a lot of things in medicine.
Yeah, great, Bob. Well, what would you like to share with our audience in terms of what you've learned in life, your philosophies of life? What else would you like to share?
Well, number one is enjoy what you're doing. My wife keeps asking me at this age, why aren't you retiring? And I said, I have two answers to that question. Number one, can you imagine me hanging around the house all day? Be careful what you wish for. The other is I really enjoy what I'm doing. So what I'm doing now is different than what I did 10 years ago. We have set up clinics for sports cardiology and genetic cardiology, and a good bit of my time is devoted to those two fields, which are emerging fields, a lot of fun, a lot of challenges, and because of the sports cardiology part of it, season tickets to the football and basketball games. So those are one thing. The other thing is forget about yesterday and think about tomorrow. And this is my canned lecture that when a fellow completes a project, writes it up, gets it published, and he comes to the office glowing over this paper that just came out last night. And I said, I will say to him routinely, enjoy it. Go out and have a drink tonight, and then put it away, because that's history. what are you going to do next? And so the advice is always think about what you're going to do next, because that's where the excitement is.
Great. Well, this has been truly inspirational, Bob. I've really enjoyed this, and it's been indeed our honor to interview you today.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you.